The used market, it's more complicated than buying new, more risky than buying new, but the value on offer is there. You just need to figure out the complications and take the risk. So let's get into figuring out those complications. But just before we get into the video, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. The channel is predicted to hit 10,000 subscribers just after New Year's Day, and I would really appreciate bringing that forward to the end of this year rather than the beginning of next year. So if you haven't subscribed already, please consider it, and I really appreciate it. Anyway, back to the video. The first thing to nail down is the brief. What's the system going to be used for, and how much have we got to spend? For this build, we're going to aim for all-round strong performance while keeping the price as low as we can. Just a really solid, high-value all-rounder. It's really simple to configure a solid all-round performing system with a little knowledge of the available parts, but it's the high value bit that's a little more complicated to figure out, which I'm sure is a barrier to a lot of people trying to part together a used build, myself included. You don't want to buy one thing and then suddenly realize you could have got something similar for less or higher performance for the same. So as a lot of things do in my life, this started with a spreadsheet, or more specifically a price versus performance spreadsheet, which, well, it tends to be most spreadsheets I make. I'll spare you all the details, but I pretty much spent a day, more like 2 or 3, listing out the last few generations or so of CPUs back to 6th generation Intel and 1st generation Ryzen, and GPUs back to AMD's R9s and Nvidia's GTX 900 series with used parts from eBay sold listings over the previous few months or so, and new prices from PC Part Picker just for reference. But to gain the performance element of the price versus performance table, I needed some performance data of all of these parts, so I took the score data from Passmark. Yes, I know, grabbing benchmark scores from pretty much anywhere isn't the be-all and end-all of how these components actually perform, especially how they'll perform in this build with the workloads we'll be testing and the rest of the hardware. We'll be doing Cinebench, Firestrike, VRMark, and Blender, by the way. But for the purposes of buying used components, let's face it, it's not the least certain variable. That lies with availability and pricing of the components. So this should give us a good enough ballpark of what we should be targeting. So with both price and performance values, we can form some price versus performance figures, and thus we have our highest value components. To keep things snappy, the cliff notes are CPU-wise, surprise surprise, the 1st and 2nd generation of Ryzen have the best value, specifically the 1600, 1700, 1200, and 2600. Actually, it carries on to the 2600X, the 1800X, the 2700, 1600. The first 15 CPUs are actually all Ryzen CPUs. You can't seem to go too far wrong with Ryzen. GPU-wise, it's a little more mixed, and it seems more disappointing at first because only 3 of the top 10 have over 4GB of VRAM. Great for storing high-resolution textures in games if that's what you're into. But the top 10 GPUs should be purchasable for less than £100 or your regional equivalent without too many problems. Highlights from the best value GPUs I'd say are the GTX 970, 1063GB and 6GB, R9 390, GTX 980, and at a push, RX 480. A nice even spread across AMD and Nvidia, and beautifully cheap. So this begs the question, what did I go for and why? Well, you can see here we've clearly got some top-end kit, and I'd like to say it's all as it seems, but there may be some red herrings in the mix. Well, more blue and orange than red. This 1000 watt power supply, it's not a 1000 watt power supply, it's just the box of a 1000 watt power supply that's holding a basic Corsair CX750. Well, it's not too far off 1000, but it's 750 watts, which is nothing special. I picked this up from eBay for £43.51, including shipping, after also getting this extremely dirty AeroCool 700 watt, which is posed for something a little less well-rounded in the future. Always the risk of buying used, it's tough to know the condition of what you're getting. We also have this 3700X Ryzen box, which of course doesn't hold a Ryzen 3700X. It actually holds a Ryzen 1700, which I picked up for £92.90, including shipping, which is between the £80 minimum price I'd set based on what I'd seen, and the 20% extra tolerance up to £96. Side note, we're working with with auctions here, so getting a low target based on what you've seen is good for scanning through what's available, but setting an upper limit providing some tolerance gives you a better chance of actually buying something and getting on with using the system you want or need. There's a trade between time and money to be struck, something you'll have to decide for yourself. So why did I put the 1700 in a 3700X box? Well, the packaging that it came shipped in was frankly astonishing. I never thought someone would be this careless with shipping a CPU. Oh yeah, you're looking at an Intel LGA 1150 series box with a larger PGA Ryzen CPU crammed in and not even taped closed. I can only describe the seller as a moron, and I think that's valid since even people with little knowledge of computer parts would probably handle this thing with more care. According to the seller, this is careful packaging. I'm not sure about you, but packaging that bends a pin isn't careful, it's careless. Anyway, rant over, it does work despite the bent pin, which I bent back, so why the 1700 over anything else? Well, it's 8 not particularly fast cores, but it's the highest performing CPU in my spreadsheet when sorting by price versus performance, aka value. Until we get to the 1800X, which according to my flaky spreadsheet could be an extra £20 or so. It's plenty enough for some gaming, rendering, so we'll save the £20 or so for other stuff. Onto the graphics card. For this, I moved a little deeper into the value sorting in the spreadsheet, opting for a GTX 980 Ti, which I grabbed for just over £130, including shipping. That's under the figures I've seen it go for, but it's more than a number of 1060 6GB cards, so why not the GTX 1060 6GB? Mainly availability at the time for a good price. The 1060 6GB does match the 980 Ti on VRAM, but hasn't got the core performance that the 980 Ti offers, and all in all, I think the 8-core Ryzen 1700 is better suited to a more powerful GPU if we're working towards a good all-round performer. Onto the RAM, I think it would be criminal to match an 8-core 1700 and 980 Ti with any less than 16GB, especially for the all-round performance sort of target we've got. I found this 4x4 set of 3000 MHz G.Skill Ripjaws 5 for just shy of £45, including shipping. That should do the trick. Yeah, more on that later. Storage for any system these days should start with an SSD of some sort. That's just common sense. But there are a couple of ways of going about it. You could start with a small SSD for the boot drive for long life overall system responsiveness. Around 240GB may do, maybe even less depending on the budget, and couple it with a 1 or 2 TB hard drive for the mass storage. Or go for more SSD capacity up front to start with, and maybe think about more storage a little later down the line if and when you need it. I'm opting for more SSD now and picked up a new 512GB Sabrent Rocket NVMe M.2 SSD, which I bought for a smidge under £50 including shipping. Not too bad. The motherboard to tie all this together is an Asus Prime X370 Pro, which for the price of £65 including shipping is a steal. I nearly managed to get hold of a Tai Chi board for less than £50, but the reminders on the Pixel 3a are useless, so at least this one came along and helped to heal the wound. It's got the M.2 slot we need for our NVMe SSD, up to 8 SATA ports and Type-C header with fan headers all over the shop and a good VRM for a little overclocking. So that's the main system out of the way and takes us to a total cost of £430. Not too bad for the performance on the table, but we're still lacking a CPU cooler and a case. This is where SilentiumPC came into play. If you've searched for cases and coolers on eBay, you might have encountered the same issue I've been having. I'll try and throw some stuff up on the screen now. The cases are either old, manky, well used, unappealing, too expensive to ship, or non-existent, and the coolers are much better. So after finalizing most of the parts for this build and looking around for a case and cooler, SilentiumPC happened to get in touch after finding my review of the Signum SG1V Evo TG ARGB, which I think you can check out up there, and asked if there's anything they could send over that I'd like to check out. After a few emails back and forth, we had a list of things they'd send over, and thus for this build, SilentiumPC sent over a Signum SG1 TG budget version of the ARGB version I previously reviewed up there, there, which was an excellent performer. And I've got the Ferra 3 Evo ARGB, which is a little overkill for this build, but a non-ARGB alternative wasn't available at the time. So that's £47 for the case and £39 for the cooler, plus £14 shipping together for a total of just shy of £100, and a total system cost of just under £530. We'll see how they perform later, but I'll say it is advisable if you want the best price versus performance that you could knock a good £10 to £20 off with a different new cooler and be completely fine. £39 is pretty steep for a used build. So just before we get into the build notes, setup and performance, we're coming right up to the Christmas holidays, and it's been a bad enough year without missing out on the shows you want to watch just because of where you happen to be over Christmas. So if you're struggling to access any content over the holidays because it's in America, Europe, wherever, consider using a VPN. Much like the bushes in World of Tanks, stay with me here, I tried to make this one work. When you're using a VPN, services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, HBO, and others won't be able to see where you originate from since you route your traffic through a server in the country of your choosing through the VPN. Admittedly, this is where the analogy breaks down, since you can only send data to them through the bush, the VPN, and then they don't know where to send it back, and then when they do, it's time to run away. Anyway, the point is, ExpressVPN has been in touch, and they're offering 3 free months with every 12-month subscription using the link in the video description. Or you can get yourself 1 month subscription for £9.99 with a 30-day money-back guarantee if you're not completely satisfied. Just enough to cover the holiday period if you're lucky enough to be with your family and friends watching movies over Christmas. The services work on pretty much any Windows, Mac, Android, iOS, and Linux devices and provides easy to use, anonymous, private, and secure internet usage with servers in over 90 countries. Just follow the links in the video description to get the deals and let them know I sent you. Onto the build and setup now. The build itself was fluid. No weird clashes or anomalies occurred. The cable management was easy enough since we're not cramming the case full of hard drives and the system posted outside of the case without an issue. But the overclocking process was challenging. Something I hadn't taken into account when selecting the system components was Ryzen 1st Gen's difficulties with RAM speed. The 3000 MHz kit by default ran at 1866 MHz, and any attempt to overclock it past 3000 MHz was unsuccessful. But it's worse than that. This kit wouldn't even run at its rated 3000 MHz, and it failed its way all the way down to 2666 MHz with timings at 1515, 1532, and so on. Apparently, the general consensus is the memory controllers of X370 boards aren't fantastic, and first generation Ryzen woes add up to a flaky performance limit, and there's not a huge amount that can be done about it. I'm sure someone with more experience than I at overclocking could squeeze more performance out here, but it's not coming from me after a good half a day of tinkering, unfortunately. So perhaps a 2600X might be a more viable substitute to get away from the Ryzen first generation issues, but you'll be missing out on a couple of cores which could be crucial depending on your workload. I didn't have any issues with the CPU directly. I managed to get it up to 3.8 GHz at 1.35 volts running smoothly in most areas, but I found after overclocking the GPU a little, I couldn't make it through some benchmarks and had to dial it back to 3.7 GHz, which seemed to do the trick, but it's a little disappointing for a 1700. The 980 Ti overclock was a bit of a struggle, as GPU overclocking can be. Every small hiccup requires a restart and tuning of the clocks. Even when you think you've got something stable in one benchmark, it might be unstable in another later down the line, and this caused quite the delay in getting benchmark results with consistent settings. I did finalize the core clock at plus 100 MHz and the memory clock at plus 500 MHz, which isn't outstanding for 980 Ti's, but it's at least better than the stock. So now all that's left to cover is the performance. Now this is a little awkward since this is the first in a series of full system builds, so there's not a lot for comparison from my control testing. However, some of the performance benchmarks can provide us some insight into comparative data. So let's get into it. Starting with the performance specific benchmarks, which are a little more interesting, Cinebench R23 shows us this 1700X isn't quite performing as well as other 1700Xs and a 16-core Threadripper CPU in the Cinebench archives for single core performance. but the result flips over a little, at least regarding the 1700X when looking at the multi-core performance. Presumably the all-core overclock actually worked out well for us. Moving on to 3D Mark Firestrike, I have got the FPS and section breakdowns to hand, but it's not relevant since the info supplied by 3D Mark is limited to the final score, so we'll work with the final score for now, and in future we'll incorporate the rest. According to 3D Mark, our system sits between a 2020 gaming laptop with an i7-9750H and RTX 2060, and a 2020 gaming PC with a 3700X and RX 5700 XT. That really shows the value of the system we've created. The typical price of a used 5700 XT alone costs nearly as much as our 1700 and 980 Ti combined, and it's not worth considering the cost of a gaming laptop if we're talking value, but a little more on that later. Sure, we're a good chunk off the pace of a 2020 gaming PC, but we're a heck of a lot cheaper. And finally, for the benchmarks, VR Mark. I wanted to include something that's a little more well-known, repeatable, and VR related, since it's one of the more expensive questions in gaming nowadays. Can it run VR games well? So in the VR Mark basic test, Orange Room, representative of lighter VR games, we're closer in the performance to the 3D Mark chosen 2020 gaming laptop than the gaming PC. FY, we're hitting 200 FPS average in this test, so we're still pretty solid. In the Cyan Room benchmark, representative of current VR DirectX 12 gaming, which is more demanding than the previous, places it more evenly between the 2020 gaming laptop and gaming PC. But compared to the lighter VR load from Orange Room, we've lost about half of the frame rate, dropping down to 107 FPS, on the edge of dropping down too low for comfort. And moving up to the futuristic VR benchmark Blue Room, this system just isn't cut out for the future of VR, at least according to VR Mark, which is probably fair. This system was sat at 41 FPS average, which I think even the 5700 XT would also be struggling to maintain a smooth 80 to 90 FPS. This is just a tough benchmark. I'll follow this up with some testing of various graphics cards on different VR games to gain some preferences between VR Mark and real VR gaming. I was going to use Half-Life Alyx as a benchmark for these videos, but as we all know, VR isn't the most user-friendly form of gaming, let alone benchmarking, so I'll figure some sort of system out for this in the future. Now, I haven't just been sitting on my behind after running a few simple benchmarks to get a few numbers. In the future, I'll be comparing this system in performance from Blender, specifically the Victor render, which took around 20 minutes with this system in both CPU and GPU options, comparing the CPU and GPU clocks, temps, and power, render times, and a few RAM statistics. I chose Victor specifically for its length and intensity regarding RAM usage. I've also got a 10-minute Firestrike combined test, which will provide us some all-round system performance statistics such as temps, power, clock speed, and frame rate. This is all for the future though, and doesn't have much bearing at the moment. It's worth noting that the CPU reached a maximum of 47 degrees Celsius delta T, which came from the Blender test, and the GPU reached a maximum of 67 degrees Celsius delta T in the Firestrike 10-minute combined test. For all these tests, the fan speeds of all the fans in the system were set to 63%, since that's the speed that the system reached 40 dBA noise output at a distance of 40 centimeters from the case at a 45-ish degree angle, which is my testing setup. Good for testing purposes, even if it's not strictly what a setup would be in reality. This will be great for future comparison though. It was also really clear that the noise output from the GPU's fans was the limiting factor here regarding noise output. The fans from the CPU cooler and the case were really quiet otherwise, so perhaps with a quieter GPU, we'd see even better performance all round. So in conclusion, the total system cost came up to £530, just under, which performance-wise is just under a 3700X with a 5700 XT, which costs more than the sum of our used system in total just for those two components, and performs better than a laptop with a 9750H with a 2060, which, for comparison purposes, I used PC Specialist here with a 10750H, which costs twice as much, albeit with a decent screen. In Firestrike and VR Mark anyway. Whichever way you cut it, this is an excellent result at £500 for a system that's more than capable of editing, gaming, pretty much anything you want to throw at it at a reasonable level, and there's more savings to be made if you can find yourself a decent used case and cooler. Speaking of which, a big thanks to SilentiumPC for providing the Signum SG1TG case and Ferra 3 Evo ARGB CPU cooler. I'm under no obligation to do this, but there are a few links in the video description to their site, which actually has well thought out filters and realistic descriptions of their products. I'd certainly recommend the case even for a used or budget build. Frankly, the performance that you get, and one of the biggest limiting factors that I found was when you're shopping on eBay, is the shipping costs for cases are at least £10, and if you get a half decent case on there for £30, you may as well bought yourself a new one. Great performance, easy to build in. You know, it's a bit of a no-brainer there. But as I said, you could do better on the CPU cooler price-wise if you're not in the market for a new high-performance ARGB cooler. Let's face it, not everyone is, but for a new ARGB build, it's a pretty neat option. That fan does glow pretty bright. Speaking of which, I have got Amazon associate links in the video description for this case and the cooler. It might not be available in your region. I know it's pretty much Europe and UK is popular in, but in the US not so much, which is a shame because it's a really decently priced, good performer. Anyway, I hope you really enjoyed this one. It's certainly not like I've created before, so I hope it came across well. If you have any suggestions for future system reviews, please let me know in the comments. This is just the first one, and it's not too late to change things before we get several systems deep into the series. Subscribe for more of these in the future, and the usual stuff like the Corsair 4000D review in the works, as well as a couple of cases and coolers from SilentiumPC, and a little peek into the performance of the average Steam system and how it compares to what we've made here. I might also get into expanding my value spreadsheet and update you guys with the best value components on the market periodically. Anyway, thanks so much for checking this one out, and I'll catch you in the next one.